Good afternoon, everyone. I want to first apologize for the technical difficulties. My camera is not working, but I want to welcome you to this virtual experience today. I'm Nikki Darby, the Director of Sales here at Redstone Village, Huntsville's only locally owned and operating continuing care retirement community. Residents here experience a robust social calendar along with new adventures amongst friends. A life plan gives you a peace of mind about the uncertainties of life or the worry about increasing costs of long-term care. In addition to the glorious views from your balcony or your patio and the safety of our underground parking that serves as a storm shelter, the residents here get guaranteed priority placement in all levels of care, including assisted living, memory care, rehab, long-term care, if and when you need it at a predictable locked-in rate. Thank you for considering Redstone Village as you ponder the future during these times of new normal. If you would like to learn more, I'm happy to schedule a time to help answer any questions that you have. We appreciate you taking your time today to listen to our guest speaker, Brad Breeding. Brad is a nationally recognized speaker specializing in retirement planning in the senior living industry. Brad spent 14 years as a personal financial advisor focusing on sound planning for retirees. He's a published author of What's the Deal with Retirement Communities. Brad is a go-to expert in his field, sharing his valuable insights on topics ranging from senior living lifestyles to healthcare to retirement planning considerations. Thanks for joining us, Brad.
Well, absolutely. Thank you for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to present, and welcome to those of you that have joined the call. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually. So what we want to talk about today, as you can see on the screen, planning your future in an uncertain environment. I think if there's anything we could all agree on, it's certainly that these are very uncertain times. So how do we kind of stay focused on our plan? What should we stay focused on during times like this as we think about our future and our finances and everything that comes along with that? So that's what we're going to cover today. A few things before we get into the content. First, as was mentioned just a moment ago, I am currently the president of a company called mylifesite.net. It is an online resource for information and guidance to help people navigate what I call complex senior living decisions. Prior to starting this company, I spent 14 years as a financial planner or as an investment advisor. And so today, everything that I'm sharing with you is totally objective because I no longer work in that industry at all. I still kind of stay up on things, maintain some of my licenses and credentials, but really I don't manage any money for anyone. So this is just all objective information and guidance that I hope can help you, again, as you plan your future. A really quick disclaimer, anything that I do mention related to finances or investments, anything like that, should not be considered personal financial or investment advice. So I want to recommend that you talk with your own financial professionals before making any decisions. And then if you've not used this format of a webinar before, this is GoToWebinar, just a few tips that might be helpful. Number one, you're all on mute right now. You'll have a microphone button or maybe a telephone button, kind of like the one you see on my screen, and it's probably gray right now, which means you're muted, and that's okay. That's anytime you have a call like this with a lot of people, you want the background noise limited. So you all are on mute. Obviously, I hope you can hear me. But if you have questions as I go through the presentation today, you can click on that section in your toolbox, if you want to call it that. Click on the questions section, and you can type in a question and submit it. And then Nikki and the team there at Redstone Village will be able to look at those as I'm presenting, and hopefully we can get to a couple of those questions at the end. And then finally, if you want to know how to either move this toolbox off of your screen or pull it back onto your screen so you can submit a question, you do that with the orange button. As you see here, you should have something like this on your screen that'll pull it out and move it back in. And so, so hopefully those tips can help you as we go through here. So what are some of the things that I'm going to talk with you about today? Number one, what are the keys to financial security, or maybe a better word is financial confidence in any environment, particularly now with the uncertainty that we have? How should I be thinking about my investments? This is something that I know is on so many people's minds, particularly with the volatility that we've had in the stock market recently. Is it a good time to sell a home or to move? This perhaps is on the mind of many of you on this call. Maybe you're trying to figure out if it's a good time to sell your home and move to Redstone Village or whatever your situation may be. How can I be sure I'm making the right senior living decisions? Obviously, you all are doing your research and conversations with the staff at Redstone Village, maybe other retirement communities as well, but what are the things to be thinking about to know you're making the right decisions? And is senior living still safe? Is congregate living or community living still safe? We'll touch on that and a few other things as I go through this today. So one of my favorite quotes comes from Mike Tyson, who once said, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched." I think there's a lot of truth in this. It feels like we've kind of been punched right now with everything we're going through with coronavirus and all of the different ripple effects of that economically, certainly from a healthcare standpoint and senior living and so forth. So, when this happens, things like this, how do we kind of stay grounded in our plan? How do we keep from getting sort of knocked off of our plan, so to speak? So what I think is really important for everybody to keep in mind right now, in my opinion, there's three keys to financial confidence: perspective, clear objectives, and then having a plan. Now, if any of these three things are missing, it's tough to have financial confidence. You have to have perspective, because without that, our emotions tend to drive our decisions, and that can sometimes lead to more costly errors in the long run. Without clear objectives, then it's really difficult to have a plan at all, or at least to have a reliable plan. So I want to spend some time going through each of these. So let's start with perspective. I know just from the comments and some of the emails we received, a lot of people, particularly those looking at moving into a retirement community, they're wondering how everything that's going on in the stock market right now and the economy, how that's going to affect things. So I'm just going to spend the next few slides talking a little bit about what's happening in the stock market. One of the things I've been asking people is, how did you feel about your financial situation in 2016? Now, why 2016? Is there anything significant about that? Well, no. Really what I'm doing is just saying, if you could go back in time a few years without really knowing what was going to happen after that. You didn't know what was going to happen in 2017 or 18 or beyond. And you could stop at 2016 and somebody asked you this, what would you have said? What would your answer have been? I suspect many of you on this call may have said, well, we feel pretty good about things. We were well on our way to recovering from the Great Recession and the housing crisis of 07 and 08. The economy was gradually improving. The stock market was certainly improving. And so I think overall, most people felt pretty good. Again, if you didn't know what was going to happen next, and in a few years after that. So let's just kind of pause it, hold on to that. I'll come back to this in a moment. So what you're looking at now is the last 6 months in the stock market in the United States. Now, I realize there's overseas markets and bond markets and things like that. But if we just look broadly at the market in the United States, this chart shows pretty much what's happened over the last 6 months. Obviously, a lot of volatility. You can see that V on the screen. So a very steep drop, preceded, of course, by this kind of gradual, steady climb in the stock market. This point right here at the top, that was the all-time high in the stock market, historical all-time high. We had had, up to that point, a 10-year bull run, the longest bull run in the history of the stock market. And then, of course, this big decline, which was a little scary for folks. But almost, I would say surprisingly to some people, we've had this pretty impressive rebound over the last couple of months. I think the stimulus helped a lot. That turnaround almost coincided to the day, it seems, to the stimulus. Now, there's all kinds of debates about the stimulus and long-term effects of that, and even, whether it's helping in different parts of the economy as intended. Nonetheless, as far as the stock market's concerned, I think it did make a difference. And some other things as well that I'll talk about in a moment. But if you follow the headlines and, wherever you get your financial news from, you'll notice a lot of times, even in just regular news, they tend to talk about drops from the high. You'll hear things like the market's off of its highs, or 10% off of its all-time highs, and things like this. And that, that paints a more dire picture sometimes than reality, because what you'll see if you look at this chart, while we're still, I don't know, maybe somewhere around 9% off the highs, if we look at the last 6 months, we're down about 2%. After yesterday, this didn't include yesterday, so maybe it's a little bit higher, but let's just say 2 to 3%. Over the last 6 months, the market's down about 2 to 3%. Now, that certainly doesn't sound, or isn't, nearly as bad as it may feel emotionally because of all the volatility. And again, because what we hear about and read about is, the market's 10% off its all-time high, or whatever the case may be. But if we go back 6 months, if you went back a year, I think we'd be in positive territory at this point. So again, what we're talking about here is perspective. Now, remember I asked the question, how would you have felt in 2016? Well, if you look at this chart, down here at the bottom left, early 2016, you can see where we were. Now, if you had said back then, we feel pretty good about things, then you would feel really good about things now, because the market is up 68% cumulatively since that time in 2016. That is a huge run to the upside in the stock market. Now, am I suggesting that any of us want to go back to where we were in 2016? Do we want to see our account values drop back to that point? Obviously not. But the reality is, as I said, we've been at a historical all-time high. We've had a 10-year bull run in the stock market. And, eventually there was going to be a pullback due to something. In fact, if you look at something else I think is interesting, in 2018, we had a pretty big drop even then. Didn't get near the attention that the most recent one got, but we had a pretty big drop right there. We were substantially further down in 2018 than we are now, just a couple of years ago. So anyway, I think, again, when we widen the lens a little bit, this helps me to take a step back and sort of take a breath and realize that, emotionally, maybe it helps me to feel like maybe things aren't as bad as we can kind of get caught up in believing they are. So another thing that I would mention is that the stock market is, by almost every measure, I would say, I think most would agree, is overpriced, and substantially so. There's a few different ways to look at that. This is just one of them. Now, if you understand what a PE ratio is, it basically is just the price of a stock relative to the earnings of that company. So in essence, it can tell you if a price is, or if a stock price is appropriate based on the fundamentals. Is it overpriced or underpriced, and that kind of thing. So if you look at this chart, this shows the average PE ratio across all 500 stocks in the S&P 500. And right now, the average is around 29 or 30. Historically, on an inflation-adjusted basis, the median is around 16. So right now, the average PE ratio is about twice of what it has been historically on an inflation-adjusted basis. So that's one indication that the market is substantially overpriced right now. The other thing, this is another way to look at it, and as I said, there's a number of different ways, but this is one other way to look at it, and this is dividend yields. And in theory, the lower the average dividend yield, then the higher or the more overpriced the market is. And if you look at this right now, we're at almost a historical low in terms of the average dividend yields on the S&P 500. So those two charts that I've just showed you, again, really indicate that the market is overpriced. And the interesting thing is, even a couple of months ago, before the market started to rebound, even then, I was looking at these things, it was overpriced at that point. Maybe not quite as much as it is now, but it was still dramatically, in my opinion, overpriced. So what does that mean? What are you to do with that information? Well, that's between you and your advisor, obviously. But, it helps me to realize that, number one, it may not be a bad time to rebalance some things, kind of take some chips off the table, recognize that we're sort of playing with house money a little bit here because we're way ahead of maybe the average trend line in the market. But also that, even though we don't want to see our account values come down or decline, we have to realize where we've been. We've just had a really high run up in the stock market. So hopefully that can help give a little perspective. Now, another reason I think we've seen the sort of reversal and where the market started to go back up these last few months is because of what you see in this quote from an article back in March. When valuations become attractive enough, courageous, contrarian-minded investors will step up to the plate and start buying. This is really sort of reflecting what I just talked about, that even back in March, there were some who were saying, I'm going to wait till this market goes down further before I put any money into it. Because, again, sometimes people don't want to put money into a market that's been at an all-time high, that just continued hitting new high points. So I think that's another reason we've seen a bit of a rebound as people got back in at some lower, at some lower stock price points. And so this is something that I think is going to continue to help to some degree, or has helped up to this point. But the question is, have we seen the bottom? Now, a few weeks ago, this question said, when will we see the bottom? Or I guess that's probably been a couple months now. It said, when will we see the bottom? I've since changed it. Have we seen the bottom? Well, it's hard to say because obviously nobody knows. I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to know. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the stock market. There's a lot of guesses. If you watch CNBC or one of these news channels, they'll interview different, experts, if you will, and they'll all have different views of where the market's heading. So that alone tells you that really nobody knows. They're just guesses, maybe educated guesses, but still guesses nonetheless. But what I do think is worthy of, stopping to realize for a moment is that the market is generally considered a leading economic indicator. If you look back at all of the previous recessions in this country, what you'll see is that the stock market began to rebound or turn around well before the actual economy, usually anywhere between 4, 5, 6 months. And so with that in mind, I sort of feel like the stock market is almost a collective view of investors of where we're going to be, say, 6 months from now. It's pretty much the opinion of an investor of kind of where we're heading. And so right now, for whatever the variety of reasons, whether it's favorable news on vaccines or treatments or, the reopening of the economy, which there's still some lingering questions about the ultimate effects of that. But I think overall right now, people feel pretty good about things. At least there's some positive signs economically, still in the housing market. So overall, I think indications are suggesting, at least the market believes, that we'll be in a better spot 6 months from now. So that's probably what we see happening. Now, if we get some news in these next couple of weeks that's less favorable, that paints a little different picture, then obviously that could change things. But right now, I believe that's kind of what's happened. So have we seen the bottom? Maybe. It's just, who knows? We'll have to see what happens in these next few weeks and so. Let's talk a little bit about the housing market and what's happening there, because some of you, maybe you're trying to decide if this is a good time to sell your home or if you should wait. And so one of the things that I think is important to realize is very much like what I just said with the stock market, in that In the housing market too, we've been at a historical all-time high. So you can see this top line on this chart. This represents inflation-adjusted housing prices in our country, average housing prices. And so you can see here, obviously, this huge run-up prior to the Great Recession and the housing crisis of 07, 08, that time period. And then, of course, we had that big drop. But you can see since that time, back up again to and have even passed where we were at that point. So back up to another historical all-time high. So as I said before, kind of like the stock market, I know we don't want to see our home prices decline. We'd like to think that the stock market and housing prices will just keep going up forever. But we know that's not going to happen, and I think we just have to remember kind of where we've been over these last few years. Now, whether to sell or wait, just a few things that might be helpful. First of all, in terms of perspective, back during the Great Recession, home prices dropped by nearly 30% on average across the country. Now, in some markets, it could have been more, in other markets less, but on average, down about 30%. All of the different projections that, at least that I've seen for the housing market right now over the next 6 months or so, shows a decline in anywhere from 2 to 4% in home prices. So even if those projections are wrong and we end up 5, 6, 7%, that's still a far cry, obviously, from what we experienced previously. And I do think that's because the fundamentals are better. The mortgage application process is tighter now, and some may not like that, but it certainly has helped. And so I think we're seeing that now. And inventories are still really tight in a lot of markets. Now, you need to obviously talk to somebody, an experienced and knowledgeable real estate professional in your area. But in so many markets, while there are certainly fewer buyers, there's also been fewer sellers. And so what's happened is because of that, both have come down. That's kind of kept inventories pretty tight in a lot of markets, not everywhere, obviously. But another thing to consider, a realtor I was speaking with told me this, and I thought it was really interesting, was that he made the point that if all the people who are either delaying their decision to list their home, or if they've already delisted their home, if all of those folks come back together at the same time, along with people who perhaps have to sell their home because of just their economic situation, if all of those kind of take place around the same period of time, that could drive inventories up considerably. And so that could make it more difficult at that point than it is now, because right now, overall, housing prices are still holding really steady. Overall, mortgage applications are up and things like that. So it's still a pretty tight market. Another thing, obviously, that's helping is low mortgage rates, record low mortgage rates. And so who knows how long that will last, but people don't want to miss out on that. You all may know that every 1% that mortgage rates go up, that decreases purchasing power by about 10%. And so people don't want to lose out on that purchasing power. That's not good for buyers or sellers. And so if that happens too, if interest rates go up about the same time that people start putting their homes back on the market, those things combined could really make it more difficult, whether it's 6 months or a year from now, than it is now. So that's just something I think that's important to keep in mind. But more than anything, just know what you're waiting on. If you say, well, I'm going to wait, I think you just need to be very clear about what that means and what you're waiting for, because otherwise you could just be waiting indefinitely, or perhaps waiting until a time where it's even more difficult to achieve your goals. So that's a little bit about perspective and the stock market, the housing market. But let's talk now about that second one, which was objectives. One of the reasons why very clear long-term objectives are so important is because without those objectives, you really can't measure the effect that any stock market changes are having on your plan. You don't know. It becomes kind of an arbitrary thing where we see the market going down, and that's kind of scary to us, and we don't want to see that happening. But too often, I'm not sure people stop to really think about what that means specifically for their situation. And sometimes there may not be a need to worry that much about it, but we have to know what our objectives are. We have to be able to connect the dots. And so let's talk for a moment about what objectives could look like. Let's talk about first primary objectives. So here's some examples. One primary objective may be to never run out of money to live comfortably. Now that's pretty straightforward. If that's your only objective, then, obviously we just need to know how much you have, how much you need to live on and so forth. And it could even mean you could draw down your principal over time to some degree if you need to, because really your only goal ultimately is just to not run out of money to live comfortably. But some of you may also say, well, I want to leave a certain amount to my family or to my charity. And I think this should be defined. I think you should say how much you want to leave, because it may turn out that you have more, and that's even better. But this makes planning a lot easier, because now, if I was an advisor still, I could look at this and I could say very easily, I know how much you have now, I know how much you want to have at the end, and I know how much you need to live on. I can connect those dots, and I can look at it and say, well, no matter what's happened in the market, even though the market's down 10, 20, 30%, whatever it may be, I could look at that and say, well, it has not substantially altered our probability to still meet your objectives. So in that case, we don't really have to worry. But if we don't know that, if we don't know those objectives, then again, it's kind of an arbitrary plan. Now, you may have some secondary objectives as well. To not be a burden on my family would be an example of one. Now, you're in conversations with the folks at Redstone Village. Well, maybe this is one of your driving motivators. Maybe you want to make sure that you have a plan for yourself, that you are not a burden on your family if something were to change in the future. And maybe you say, one of your secondary objectives is to protect against the cost of long-term care. Well, that's a good one as well. There could be others, but these things are kind of a part of your primary objectives. They're planned for as a part of your primary objectives. So being very clear on these things is extremely important to your overall plan. Which leads to that last piece, the third one. So how do you plan? Well, obviously I can't go into a lot of detail on this. You're all in different situations, but something that I think helps to kind of keep it simple, just logically for me, what I think is really helpful is to first take a look at all of your, what I would call fixed or stable income sources. And what I'm really talking about here is your non-investment related income sources. So set your investments and retirement accounts aside for a moment. What are all of your other income sources? For most of you, I'm sure it's Social Security. For some of you, maybe pension income of some sort. Maybe you even have some rental income, but whatever those sort of reliable long-term income sources are, add those up. And then, of course, look at all of your expenses, discretionary and non-discretionary. Discretionary, you have a little more flexibility if you do need to make adjustments. But you look at those two things, and then obviously that's either going to generate a surplus or a shortfall. Now, if you're one of the fortunate ones where there's a surplus, or even if you break even, where all of your other income sources meet your expenses, that's wonderful, because that means you don't even have to rely as much or worry as much about what's happening in your investment accounts or retirement accounts. But for most people in retirement, there is a shortfall. That's not uncommon at all. That's the whole reason why we have investments in retirement accounts, is to help supplement those other income sources, or to fill the gap between these two things. And so with the recognition of that, it really comes down, the plan is really about, okay, what's that shortfall? What's that difference or that shortfall? And then looking at keeping our objectives in mind. Okay, how much do we have? How much do we need to draw off of our investments to fill that gap or to meet that shortfall? And are we in position to do that over our lifetime, factoring in inflation and everything else, and still meet our long-term objectives? But as I said, if we don't understand these things, if we don't really know what our objectives are, then we're just kind of floating in the wind. If the market goes down, we get really concerned. The plan kind of becomes, well, I want to earn what I can in the market and lose as little as I can. But if you can't really connect these dots, then it's hard to maintain financial confidence when things are kind of going haywire. Okay. So lastly, what I would say, I recommend this to a lot of people, there's no sense in taking more risk with your money than necessary. Sometimes I've found that people, they stress about what's happening in the market, and I look at it and think, well, you don't really even need to have that much money in the market. If you can, you want to have a high probability of meeting your goals with as little risk as possible is ultimately the goal. So if you only need to earn 2 or 3% on your money to still have a high probability of meeting your goals, then why subject yourself to the risk that comes along with trying to earn higher rates than that? So that's kind of just the last thing I would say on that. So now let's talk about planning beyond finances, because if I were to use the phrase retirement planning with somebody, usually their mind immediately thinks about investments or finances, and that is a big part of it. But there's more to it than that. And retirement planning doesn't end when somebody retires. It continues and probably even becomes more important throughout retirement. But it might look a little bit different. This survey was done several years ago by Merrill Lynch, and I suspect the answers probably wouldn't change too much if they did it again today. But they asked people in retirement, what are your biggest concerns about living a long life? And you can see the top answer at 72%, serious health problems. No surprise there. Not being a burden on my family. Even things like being lonely, not having a purpose, and so forth. So if you were to think about what's really important to you in your life, or think about what peace of mind means for you in your life, I would suspect that in many ways, if peace of mind is the opposite of this. In other words, the extent to which you can minimize or protect yourself against these concerns, that's going to help increase your peace of mind. So as we think about that, and we think about what is a retirement plan, well, the first category certainly is finances. That is obviously an important part. 2 of those answers would go in that category, running out of money and having nothing to leave family. But it goes beyond that. This is what I would call preventative health or wellness or lifestyle. I actually think this is an important part of your overall retirement plan. You can see, again, 2 of the answers from that survey would go in this category. And these are really more social wellness concerns. And there's many different aspects of wellness: intellectual wellness, vocational wellness, spiritual, emotional, obviously social, and so forth. So that's a really important part of your plan, because not only is it going to help you with your overall well-being today, but it can come back and impact your finances later, because in theory, the healthier you're living today, the lower your medical bills will be in the future. But we do know that sometimes things still happen. Many times somebody's health can change gradually, but other times it can change suddenly and unexpectedly. And that becomes a very difficult situation for that individual and for their family quite often. So if you look at this, I call this the post-health event category, meaning what is your plan if something were to change, particularly if it changed unexpectedly and suddenly? What's your post-health event plan? The number 1 answer on that survey earlier was serious health problems. Clearly that would go in this category. And then finally, not being a burden on my family. That would go in this last category of family. What involvement would you want or not want from your family if something were to change? You could even put things like estate planning in this category and so forth. But these to me are the 4 areas that make up a retirement plan, because they are all related in many ways. They all kind of come back to finances in the end. But here's a more important point. Where you live throughout your retirement years actually plays a really important role in all of these categories. Where you live has an effect on the extent to which these concerns can arise in your life. I mean, whether it's being a burden on your family or where you're living could definitely play a role in that. Post-health event plan. If serious health problems arise, where you live absolutely could play a role in determining how that scenario plays out. Preventative health, being lonely, these are social wellness components. Where you live plays a part in that. So you can see my point. So remember, retirement planning goes beyond finances, and where you live is a big part of it. So as we talk about where you live, let's talk briefly about some of the different options. I'm not going to spend much time on this. I know, again, you're obviously talking with the team at Redstone Village, but some of you may be further along in your research process than others. But just a few things I'll mention. Number one, all the terminology, the different categories, it can be so confusing. If you go online, you'll see different websites that use some of these terms, and there's many others, but they use them interchangeably or incorrectly, or two different sites will use the same sort of terms differently. And you almost have to set aside the categories or this terminology and just know what to sort of look for, no matter what the category is. That's the best way to analyze and compare options. And so it's really about recognizing the trade-offs. Virtually any type of retirement community, regardless of the category, you can look at these trade-offs, and it can really be helpful. And there's other components. Don't get me wrong. In the amount of time that we have now, I can't get into all of it. But these trade-offs are important to understand. The first, of course, is the cost today. When I say today, I mean while you don't need any type of care. So you're living in the retirement community, Redstone Village, or wherever it is, you don't need any type of care. What's the cost to live there? Obviously, you have the monthly cost and perhaps in many cases an entry fee as well. But what's that cost today? And then, of course, you have to look at what's the level of what I call hospitality services and amenities. What's offered by the community? Obviously, this is going to have an effect on the cost. So you need to recognize that trade-off. What's included in your monthly cost and what's extra. If you can't understand or if you don't have a grasp on those things, it's hard to make a comparison or an analysis. You could even include things in here like location, or maybe even the view, or the size of the floor plan. But the reality is some communities simply provide more in the way of these types of things than others do. So that has to be a part of your decision in understanding what's important to you, what's the value of certain things to you, and if you're willing to pay for it. But we also have to think about the future. And that leads to this third category. What types of care are available? If something were to change later on, what types of care are available within that community? Would you have to move again, or maybe even move another time after that? Some retirement communities provide very little in the way of care. Others provide a little bit of care, and then still others provide a very broad spectrum, the full continuum, just like Redstone Village does. They provide all types of services so that residents, for the most part, if something changes, they can stay there. And that's important to people. They want to know that they have a plan in place, and that's valid. Sometimes people can't even put a value on that when compared to what the situation would look like if that happened in their own home or what have you. That peace of mind, again, is hard to sometimes put a value on. But you need to understand what types of care are available if you should need it. And then lastly, what's the cost of that care? If you should need care later on within that community, what's the cost of that care? Some communities, you'll pay the full market cost, full market rate. Others, you'll pay a deeply discounted rate. I know Redstone Village offers a contract where your monthly rate doesn't change. At least it won't change very much if you ever need care and those kind of things. So you just have to recognize these trade-offs. Sometimes you'll pay more today and less if you need care. Other times maybe you'll pay less today and more if you need care. You have to think about all the services and amenities and what's even available. So once you understand these four trade-offs, it's much easier to do comparisons, regardless of the categories or the terminology. Now, in the last little bit here, I want to talk about, senior living, retirement living, whatever terminology we want to use, and coronavirus. Obviously, this is something that's on a lot of people's minds right now. And so I'm not a medical, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a healthcare administrator. So I'm not going to speak on a really granular level about these things, but I am in touch via email and phone with a lot of not only prospective residents, but also even current residents. I had a coffee just the other morning with somebody that lives in a community very similar to Redstone Village, and we obviously read a lot at our company about things going on. I talk with staff members at a lot of communities. So I'm just going to share with you some of my sort of outside perspectives. And I think the first thing we have to do is separate in our minds what I call care settings. That would be like nursing care and assisted living from independent living, because it's a little different there in terms of the effects. So let's talk first about care settings. I mean, we know that nationally the biggest impact has been felt in, what I would call freestanding or standalone nursing homes. Some of these are individually owned for-profit communities. Some of them are part of a bigger chain, perhaps. Some of them are maybe government run, but a lot of them are just sort of standalone, meaning they're not a part of a bigger community like Redstone Village. And this isn't true across the board, but predominantly that's where all these big outbreaks we've heard about, certainly in New York before and so forth, were in some of these sort of single site kind of nursing facilities. And in some cases, those outbreaks were perpetuated by a lack of early response. Unfortunately, I think if there's one thing we know is that those who acted most early and decisively, that made a big impact. And so in many cases that did happen. We don't hear enough about all the different organizations that did a good job. We only hear about the worst ones. And so I don't think that's fair, because the reality is the vast majority of places have not had these major outbreaks. Now, I realize an outbreak's usually defined as 2 or more, so that's tough. But these big outbreaks we've seen, it's not the norm, but it's just what we hear about. But obviously, when you have a situation, particularly early on, a new virus that could spread asymptomatically, and even on top of that, a lack of resources in many cases, a lack of testing, a lack of some of the protective equipment that was necessary. So many of these communities and these facilities have been fighting an uphill battle. They've even taken the necessary steps, and it's even been difficult in some cases. So again, we don't hear about the positive cases. All the healthcare workers working in nursing homes and assisted living, they're putting their lives on the line too, but we don't hear about that. So anyway, I think that's important to remember. And some of these facilities have had to take cases from hospitals. I know in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I am, I think 2 or 3 patients were discharged from the hospital to this nursing facility. And then it was turned around the next week and reported that they had an outbreak. Obviously, from a PR perspective, that's unfortunate, because they had not had any prior to that. So some of those things, too, that we don't hear about as much. But for me, overall, I'm an optimist. I think that everything happening right now, as tragic as it's been overall, as tough as it's been, I think so much is going to be learned that's only going to help make things better in the future. I actually was on a call last week with the lady who started assisted living in our country over 30 years ago out in Oregon. And she said the same thing. She said she really believes what we're learning is only going to make things better. And so that was good for me to hear that, because I feel the same way. I'm already seeing some technology that's being developed for these kind of things going forward, early detection and prevention technology. Certainly we'll see some design changes, maybe tightening of certain protocols, but I think it's all only going to help long term. So let's talk a minute about independent living. As I said, that's a little different. Residents obviously have more flexibility, meaning they can get out and do more. Obviously, they can walk around the community on walking trails, nature trails, whatever's available there. They're doing, parades, socially distant parades and happy hours and these kind of things. So it's obviously a little different there. It's not ideal, don't get me wrong. It hasn't been ideal for any of us. I know even for my family and our kids are home every day. We're staying pretty much at home for the most part. It hasn't been easy for anybody. But what I have found in the conversations that I've had is that early on, many of the residents were somewhat fearful. I heard a couple that said, if it really hits here, we're out of here and that kind of stuff. But what I noticed really quite rapidly over the next few weeks after that was that people started to realize, where we are is actually a pretty good place to be. They realized that they were taken care of and that the staff was providing so much and, really taking all the precautions and everything. And so it gave way to more of a gratitude very quickly. You can see this picture. This is from an article that I was reading last week about a community down in Florida. And I know this has happened at so many other communities where the residents were out just, with holding signs, thanking the staff for all they were doing. And I see this and hear this story over and over. So residents, maybe not all of them, but for the most part, there's this really deep sense of gratitude and this sense of community, with the recognition that even though we have to stay isolated for the most part, there's still a community here. We're still kind of in this thing together. And I think so psychologically and emotionally, that's really good for a lot of people to know that they're in this kind of together, have a support network there within that community. And then finally, just the resiliency and creativity that I've seen among residents has been really impressive and actually quite entertaining to see all the different ways that they are maintaining that sense of community in a safe way has been pretty impressive to me. This was a quote that I found in an article that I think is really kind of captures what I've just been describing. This is a resident of a community similar to Redstone Village out in Texas. And he said, the residents here feel far from trapped. In fact, they're grateful. If there's a good place to be at a time like this, it's here, he said. And then he says, the people here, again, that community, share the good times and the bad. So we'll get through it together. And that I thought was really powerful. He went on to talk about how if he was in his own home right now, how he'd be quite frightened, if something were to change or what have you, to be in his own home. So I know that it's not one size fits all. We're all in different situations, and I'm not suggesting that, that staying in your own home is better or worse for everybody. But, I do think that we don't hear about these things. I think a dark cloud has been painted over the whole senior living industry, but I know so many residents are just really grateful right now for being where they are. And so lastly, this idea of, am I better off at home? Is that it's still safe to move into a retirement community? Well, there again, I think we have to think about independent living and care differently. I've talked a little bit about independent living, that sense of community and gratitude. But for those who are, closer to maybe needing care, or certainly if they're already receiving or in need of care, being in the home right now has been extremely difficult for a lot of people, because what's happened is all the challenges that come with that anyway, the challenges of aging in place have been magnified in a lot of ways. Caregivers in and out of the house, there's already a lot of turnover in that industry, and now that's even magnified as well. So there's even more turnover. So different people coming in and out of the house, different faces. You just don't have that consistency. You don't know what their exposure has been in terms of the virus. Just something as easy as getting meals on a regular basis. That's the number one thing I've heard from residents, is they love the fact that they've had their meals, delivered as needed every day. Just involvement of family, whether they can even be involved, and these kind of things if necessary. And some of these apply whether you're in home or not. But for those in their own home, they're shouldering a lot of this on their own, which is very difficult. So anyway, I think people have to weigh all of these things out. But in summary, number one, have clear objectives. We talked about those three things: objectives, and then plan accordingly. Because without objectives, you really can't plan. Keep perspective. Don't let your emotions drive your plan. Without perspective, it's easy to let your emotions get in the way. Keep it simple. I talked about sort of that, your other income sources and your expenses, whether it's shortfall, surplus, and that kind of thing. Retirement planning is more than just financial planning. I talked about those different categories in that survey and how they all kind of come back to finances, but really where you live is an important part of all of that. I think what we've learned, or what the industry is learning, is only going to help going forward. And the challenges of aging in place in many ways are magnified at this time. So it's more difficult. And for some people, I've heard them tell me that they're kind of frightened, to be in their home, particularly for those who are by themselves or single, residents and that kind of thing. So anyhow, these are just some things to keep in mind. And before we go to questions, I just want to thank you all again for joining. I hope you learned something that can be of help to you as you go forward in your planning from here. So thank you again. And I guess now we want to call Nikki back on the screen. I know your video is not working, but are you there?
I am.
All right. Good. So do we have some questions we want to try to cover?
There are a couple questions, actually. I believe you hit one or two of them, but if you could just summarize for us one more time. The first question is, life plan communities require an entry fee. Is it a right move to make if I have a long-term care policy?
Yeah, I could probably spend 20 minutes answering that question, but I would say, trying to think of the easiest way to answer this. Yes, I get that question a lot, and it's not like just because you have a long-term care policy that you shouldn't necessarily move into an entry fee community. So some communities like Redstone Village, your monthly fee doesn't change if you need care services, or if it does, maybe it doesn't change much. I haven't talked with Nikki in detail about Redstone Village, but in general, your monthly fee stays about the same. So it kind of works like long-term care. And so sometimes people ask me, am I doubling up? And in some ways you could say you are, but the benefit also doubles up, because even though your monthly rate doesn't change, now you can use your long-term care insurance. So you could pay significantly less after you start receiving care than you were paying when you were living independently, because you're using your long-term care insurance on top of that benefit that the community is already providing. The biggest thing is just being in the best situation for you. And, sometimes I will tell people, if you want to cut back on your long-term care insurance benefits, which would lower your premium, then maybe that's something to consider, but I wouldn't drop it for a variety of reasons that I wouldn't get into now, that I don't have time to get into, but I wouldn't drop it. But there's some different options like that. But yes, it still can work quite well in many situations. But I would talk with the staff. I know they've had obviously plenty of residents over the years that have had long-term care, so maybe they can share with you some of what they've seen from other residents.
Thank you. There's another question. Why are life plan communities a smart choice versus the many rental products?
Another great question. Well, it kind of, to me, comes back to those trade-offs. In the end, things all tend to work out perhaps about the same. You really have to think about things in terms of lifetime cost. So, for instance, a rental community, you won't have an entry fee. So right out of the gate, it's less expensive. However, you also have to consider the lifetime cost, meaning that one of two things is going to happen. If everything's equal, let's say you had two identical communities and one was entry fee and one was just rental. Well, the monthly cost of the rental has to be substantially higher on a monthly basis than at the entry fee community. If it's not, then there's something off. One of the two is mispriced, because if they're not getting money on the front, it's got to come on an ongoing basis. And then what happens at many rental communities, at all of them, if they even provide all the different levels of care, you're going to pay more for it at that time. So if you don't ever need care, if we had a crystal ball and we knew you wouldn't ever need care of any kind, then, a rental community financially may very well look better. If somebody needs care or needs substantial levels of care, and that community provides it at a discounted rate, then when you add up the lifetime costs, you could actually come out better at a life planning community. So I guess my point is, it goes back to those trade-offs. It's kind of like more now, more later sort of thing. And so you can't just make those assumptions that one's all of a sudden less than the other just because it may be so on the front end. You have to look at it over lifetime. But the more important thing beyond all that is recognizing you need to live somewhere that number one, where you're going to be happiest and you're going to live the most fulfilling lifestyle possible, and also make sure that you're most comfortable with your plan for the future. Because living where you're comfortable and have peace of mind, that's the most important thing. I mean, I'll tell people sometimes, even if you pay more for it, it may be worth doing so if that's where you're happiest and have the most peace of mind. So kind of a long answer there. I hope I didn't confuse you, but that's kind of how I look at some of that.
Thank you. And then one final question. What are the most important things to consider when looking at a retirement community?
Oh, boy. There's a lot that goes into that, and I could spend a lot of time on it. I mean, you kind of have, some of these quantitative aspects and qualitative aspects. So quantitative is things like, obviously the cost and the financial aspects, understanding the contract and the contract details, understanding things like how well managed it is and all these kind of things. And then more qualitative is just like lifestyle. Are you happy there? Do they have, what's the culture? Are you comfortable there? Because when you think about what a retirement community really is, it's not just the walls. It's not the physical structure. As I often say, it's not a place you just move into. It's really like you're becoming a part of something, or that's how it should be. It's the people, it's that's what makes a retirement community. It's the people. And so I think moving in, where you can enjoy that, where you can become a part of that, where you can develop those relationships and really take advantage of that, that's what's going to be more meaningful long term, is because if something does change later on, you have such strong relationships there that are going to kind of walk through that journey with you. So those are the more sort of, qualitative aspects of the decision. So it's a big decision. There's a lot to consider. It's a lifestyle, a healthcare, a financial, and a housing decision all wrapped up into one. But those are kind of those are kind of the two categories where I break it up. Anything else?
I don't see any other questions. Thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate you sharing your insights and expertise in the senior industry. And again,
Sure.
if there's anyone that would like to, learn more about Redstone Village or has any specific questions, feel free to reach out to me. Again, I'm Nikki Darby, the Director of Sales here at Redstone Village.
Okay. Well, thank you again for having me, Nikki. Wish you all the best of luck. And I guess that concludes our call. So have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.